I was asked to speak specifically to the question of the African National Congress and where it stands today. Now, of course, there's no question that over the last 100 years, the ANC has carried the hopes of many people, that many extraordinary people have helped to shape it. There's no question that over the years, with obvious ebbs and flows and ups and downs and some false starts, which of course are typical of any project when you try to organize and struggle, the ANC has been able, at many points in history, to absorb popular political energies and creativity, to allow them to renew its struggle. There's no question that the African National Congress in 1994 represented, not exclusively, but primarily, the aspirations, the organizational aspirations, the more personal aspirations of millions of people in South Africa, and that it has the singular credit to its name, which will always remain, of, for the first time, bringing everyone in South Africa into one polity, under one law, one rule of law, where at least formally there's equality for everyone. Of course, that transition was not perfect. It was not without its problems, and there are many people in the ANC who acknowledge that frankly, and there's a vibrant debate about it. But there was a perception, not universally held, but very widely held in 1994 and after that whatever the limits were to the transition, whatever the limits were to the choices that were made after that, that ultimately time was on the side of justice, that ultimately time was on the side of the people. So if things weren't perfect, if things were going wrong, we needed to be patient, that it would take a long time to put right what had been so violently and ruthlessly put wrong over a very long time. Now, that discussion about what the limits of the transition are has largely been about economics, about policy choices, in the ANC's language, about the balance of forces and compromises that needed to be made and so forth. That's a very important debate, obviously. But I think we also need to take seriously that it's not, the limits to that moment were not simply about economics and policy. They were also about politics. And I mean two things by that. One is that the ANC, as national liberation movements have habitually done when they've come to power, didn't encourage people to remain mobilized. It certainly didn't encourage people to remain mobilized in an independent way. But there's also something else that is not often spoken about, which is that the democracy that we achieved in 1994 was a full democracy for someone in the position that I'm in at the moment. You know, academic, journalist. I'm able to teach, research, write with complete freedom in South Africa. In that space. What was not fully achieved was democracy outside of that kind of elite space. Now, that's not unique to South Africa. You find someone like Partha Chatterjee writing about that in India. It's not uncommon. But many of the people that I've come to know in Nabehlali have never enjoyed the freedom that I've enjoyed after 1994. They've never been able to organize freely. They've always faced real threats of having to leave their homes, of having their homes demolished, threats of violence if they are seen to be challenging the ruling party. Now, when that has been acknowledged, it's often been assumed that this is also something like economic and social problems that will come right with the passing of time, that democracy, in the ugly language of developmental experts, will be consolidated. Now, if this was the case, if over time things were getting better, we could look to the African National Congress with optimism. But things are not getting better. I think it's indisputable by every measure that things are getting worse. Politically, I think if you look at economics, if you look at the unemployment crisis, if you look at the absolute catastrophe of public education in South Africa, if you look at housing, there are very serious intractable problems, and at the moment there's no realistic rational grounds for optimism about any of those things. But what I'm primarily concerned about in the few minutes that I have tonight is to make the point very strongly and clearly that what has happened in recent years is that the lack of democracy for people at the bottom of society is getting precipitously worse. It's declining very rapidly. And there are all kinds of ways that that can be demonstrated. If you look, for instance, at how policing has been transformed. You know, the police were demilitarized after apartheid. They've been remilitarized. The police have been killing people, unarmed people engaged in popular protest at an extraordinary rate. Last year, it was 11 people. Torture, which largely did disappear after the end of apartheid, has now returned and is now common. The torture of political activists as well. People being arrested on trumped-up charges. People not being allowed to exercise their normal legal rights, like the right to stage a march. Bans on marches, unlawful, are absolutely common. Abuhlagi has struggled against this for years. What's of even more concern than repression through the police, because at least in principle there are some mechanisms for holding the police accountable, is the new phenomenon that, to my knowledge, begins with this attack on Abuhlagi in 2009, which is of the ruling party mobilizing its members, or allowing people within the party anyway, to mobilize its members to engage in violence against people who are critical of the party. It's happened to Abuhlagi, it's happened to the landless people's movements in Johannesburg, it's happened to the unemployed people's movement. This is a very, very dangerous situation. When you have a sanction, and I'm not suggesting for one moment that everyone in the ANC gives that sanction, but very important, powerful people do give that sanction for the party to engage in violence with an implicit state sanction against people who are seen as being critical. That's a major degeneration. It's also, of course, quite clear that this precipitous decline in the limited democracy that was achieved for ordinary people is now extending itself into the elite part of society to some degree. I mean, there are laws being discussed around the governance of the former Bantustans, which are plainly anti-democratic, which are plainly regressive. There's a law being discussed around the regulation of access to information that is plainly regressive as well. It's also a case that the language of many figures in the party, certainly not someone like Dr. Pallo Fordan, who, to my mind, gave the very best response from anyone in the party to the massacre at Marikana. But for many leading figures in the party are using a language publicly that is plainly not democratic. It's the language of enemy, it's the language of treason, it's the language of war, and it's becoming increasingly normalized as is a public performance of power that is very masculinized, in some cases very militarized. I think things are plainly not getting worse. There's no longer any rational grounds for saying that time is on our side, and the people in the ANC who are democratic, to me, do not seem to have any power within the party to challenge what is happening.